Welcome to Night Lesson. Relax and learn along the way.
Intro. Hypatia of Alexandria. Imagine a vast library containing all the knowledge of the ancient world. Thousands of scrolls on mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Now imagine this library burning. Imagine the accumulated knowledge of centuries turning to smoke and ash. This is the world where our story tonight begins. A world at a turning point, where old knowledge was considered a threat, and new relentless beliefs were seizing power. And in the midst of this intellectual fire stood a woman, a beacon in a darkening age, considered the last great thinker of antiquity. A woman whose mind was so brilliant that the powerful sought her counsel, and whose wisdom was so feared that it became her undoing. Now close your eyes. Let the sounds of the day fade away and follow my voice to the dusty, crowded streets of ancient Alexandria. We are setting out on the trail of a nearly forgotten hero of science, a woman who was more than just a teacher. She was a symbol of a world that could have been. Her name was Hypatia. Chapter 1. Origin and Early Years. In the gentle twilight of the late 4th century, as the Roman Empire already bore the signs of its inexorable change, the city of Alexandria lay like a jewel on the coast of Egypt. Founded by Alexander the Great, it had long been not just a city, but a pulsating heart of scholarship, a melting pot of cultures and ideas. The waves of the Mediterranean that lapped its shores seemed to carry the wisdom of centuries, distributing it through the city's veins. The very air was filled with a special energy, a mixture of the dry desert wind, the salty breath of the sea, and the intellectual fervor that seemed to pour from the pores of its numerous schools, libraries, and philosophical circles. In the midst of this vibrant mosaic, around the year 355 A.D., a girl was born whose name would become synonymous with wisdom and tragic fate. Hypatia. Her birthplace alone was a promise. Alexandria was the city of the famous lighthouse of Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which showed ships the safe way into the harbor. In the same way, Hypatia's mind would later light the path to knowledge for countless seekers. It was also the city of the Musam, that legendary home of the Muses, which once housed the largest library in the world. Although the great main library had likely been decimated by fires and riots by Hypatia's time, its spirit lived on in the daughter library at the Serapeum, and in countless private collections and schools. The scent of old papyrus and ink was omnipresent, a perfume of knowledge that pervaded the streets. Hypatia's origin was inseparably linked to this intellectual heritage. She was the daughter of Theon of Alexandria, a man who was himself a prominent figure in the city's intellectual life. Theon was not a simple artisan or merchant. He was a respected mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher who taught at the Musam. He was one of the last known scholars to be associated with this venerable institution. Theon was a man of transition. He lived in a time when the old pagan traditions of the Greco-Roman world were increasingly being challenged by the rising Christian religion. Yet in his heart, he was a guardian of classical knowledge, a preserver of the geometric clarity of Euclid and the astronomical precision of Ptolemy. Imagine the house where Hypatia grew up. It was probably not a magnificent palace, but a home filled with books and instruments. The walls were perhaps not hung with expensive tapestries, but with star charts and geometric drawings. Instead of the noise of soldiers or merchants, one heard the soft scratching of a reed pen on papyrus, the hushed conversation about mathematical proofs or the movement of the planets. One can imagine the small, curious girl's spirit wandering among the papyrus scrolls, looking at the complex diagrams, and listening to her father's learned discussions with his students and colleagues. Theon recognized his daughter's extraordinary talent early on, in a society where the education of women was at best considered a desirable luxury for the upper class, and was mostly limited to household management, music, and literature. Theon made a remarkable and unconventional decision. He decided not only to teach Hypatia, but to make all the knowledge available to him accessible to her. He wanted not just to raise an educated woman, but a consummate scholar, his intellectual heiress. The education of the young Hypatia was therefore comprehensive and profound. It began, as was common for children of her time and station, with the foundation of Greek literature. She read Homer and Hesiod, the great tragedians, and the lyric poets. These works not only trained her fluency and rhetorical skill, but also gave her the cultural and mythological foundation upon which all classical philosophy was built. She learned to express herself with precision and elegance, a skill that would later make her lectures so famous. One can imagine Theon explaining the complex metaphors of the Iliad to her, or discussing the moral dilemmas in the plays of Sophocles with her. But the heart of her education was undoubtedly science and mathematics. Theon himself was an editor and commentator of important scientific works. He was working on a new edition of Euclid's Elements, the fundamental textbook of geometry that had shaped mathematical thinking for centuries. It is more than likely that Hypatia assisted him in this work. Imagine her, perhaps still a teenager, poring over the precise logical proofs, reconstructing the geometric figures with a compass and ruler, and learning to understand the world in a language of lines, angles, and circles. This training in Euclidean geometry was more than just arithmetic. It was a school of logical thinking, of clarity, and of irrefutable proof. It taught her to start from axioms, and step by step to reach unshakable conclusions, a tool of thought of inestimable value. Another monumental work that Theon engaged with, and introduced his daughter to, was Ptolemy Almagest. This book was the Bible of ancient astronomy, a comprehensive mathematical description of the cosmos as it was then understood, with the Earth at the center and the planets, the Sun and the Moon orbiting it on complex paths called epicycles. For the young Hypatia, studying the Almagest must have been like deciphering the divine blueprint of the universe. Theon taught her the necessary trigonometry to calculate the positions of the celestial bodies. He showed her how to use astronomical instruments like the astrolabe, a complex device used to measure the altitude of stars and perform numerous astronomical calculations. There is historical evidence that Hypatia not only supported her father but actively improved his work. In Theon's commentary on the third book of the Almagest, there is a note stating that this edition was reviewed by the philosopher Hypatia, my daughter. This is a rare and invaluable insight into their early collaboration. It shows that her reputation as a philosopher was already established, and that her father valued her contributions so highly that he mentioned her by name in his own work. She was no longer just the dutiful student. She was a recognized colleague. One can picture the scene. Father and daughter, sitting by candlelight or the soft glow of an oil lamp over a complex table of astronomical data, their heads together as they check calculations, correct errors, and discuss the majestic order of the heavens. In addition to mathematics and astronomy, Hypatia was also introduced to philosophy. Alexandria was a center of Neoplatonism, a philosophical movement that built on the teachings of Plato but combined them with elements from Aristotle, the Stoics, and mystical traditions. Theon, although primarily a mathematician, was also well versed in these teachings. He taught Hypatia the fundamental principles, the existence of a supreme transcendent One, from which all reality emanates in different stages, and the goal of human life to ascend back to this origin through intellectual and spiritual discipline. For Hypatia, mathematics was not just an abstract science, but entirely in the spirit of the Platonists and Pythagoreans, a path to the purification of the soul and the recognition of the divine order. The harmony of numbers and the perfect movement of the stars were for her visible manifestations of invisible, eternal truths. Thus Hypatia grew up in an environment that provided her not only with knowledge, but also with a certain attitude toward knowledge, an attitude of reverence, precision, and the deep conviction that the search for truth is the noblest path a human can take. Her father gave her not just facts and formulas, but also confidence in her own intellectual abilities. He raised her to be a thinker who dared to ask questions, to critically examine established texts, and to make her own contributions. While most girls of her age were preparing for marriage and running a household, Hypatia was preparing to unravel the mysteries of the cosmos and to teach the deepest questions of philosophy. Her early years in Alexandria, under the loving and demanding guidance of her father Theon, were the foundation upon which her later, extraordinary life was built. They were the roots that reached deep into the fertile soil of Alexandrian intellectual life, giving her the strength to grow into one of the most luminous figures of late antiquity. In the quiet of her study, surrounded by the works of the greatest thinkers of the past, the mind was formed that would soon inspire the next generation of philosophers and scientists. The young woman from Alexandria was on the threshold of assuming her inheritance and writing history herself. Chapter 2: Education in Athens and Alexandria. After the foundation for Hypatia's extraordinary education was laid in her father's house, a period of deepening and broadening her horizons followed, a time of travel and learning that would solidify her reputation as one of the leading intellectuals of her era. Tradition required an aspiring philosopher to travel to the sources of knowledge, to study at the famous schools, and to exchange ideas with the leading scholars of his time. For a woman, this was a highly unusual path, yet Hypatia, driven by her insatiable thirst for knowledge and the unwavering support of her father, walked it with the same determination with which she mastered the most complex mathematical proofs. Her journey, according to later sources, took her to Athens, the venerable cradle of Western philosophy. Let us follow this journey in our imagination. Picture the ship that took Hypatia from Alexandria to Athens. The voyage across the Mediterranean was no simple excursion in those days. It was long, often dangerous, and subject to the whims of the weather. But for a young woman like Hypatia, it must also have been exhilarating. As the coast of Egypt slowly disappeared over the horizon, she could observe the sky, that same starry sky she had studied so intensely. The constellations whose paths she calculated were now her real guides across the open sea. Each night offered her a living planetarium, a confirmation of the cosmic order she had explored in the works of Ptolemy. The journey itself was a practical lesson in astronomy and geography. The arrival in Athens must have been a deeply moving moment for Hypatia. Alexandria was a relatively young, cosmopolitan and bustling metropolis. Athens, on the other hand, was old and steeped in the dignity of history. As she reached the port of Piraeus and made her way up into the city, she stepped onto the ground where Socrates had once asked his uncomfortable questions. Plato had founded his academy, and Aristotle had taught in the Lyceum. Above the city, the Acropolis with the Parthenon was enthroned, an architectural masterpiece that even in ruins still testified to the golden age of Athens. For a Neoplatonist like Hypatia, this was holy ground. To be here meant to walk in the footsteps of the masters whose thoughts had shaped her entire intellectual life. In Athens, she sought out the Neoplatonic school, which at that time was led by Plutarch of Athens and his successor Syrianus. This school was different from the one in Alexandria. While the Alexandrian tradition in which Hypatia had grown up placed a stronger emphasis on science, mathematics, and the annotative interpretation of classical texts, the Athenian school was more deeply rooted in metaphysical and religious speculation. Here they engaged intensely with theurgic practices, rituals aimed at making contact with the gods and purifying the soul. They studied the Chaldean oracles and tried to connect philosophical insight with direct spiritual experience. For Hypatia, this was a new, fascinating dimension of philosophy. She, who was at home in the clear, rational world of mathematics and astronomy, was now confronted with the mystical and esoteric aspects of Neoplatonism. It is to be assumed that she approached these new teachings with the same intellectual curiosity and critical spirit as she did everything else. She listened to lectures on Iamblichus and Porphyry, who strongly emphasized the metaphysical dimension of Platonic doctrine. She discussed the nature of the soul, the hierarchy of divine beings, and the possibility of mystical union with the One. One can imagine the debates in which she participated. A young woman from the scientifically oriented Alexandria, arguing with the established venerable masters in Athens about the most subtle points of theology and metaphysics. Her training in logic and exact science must have been of great use to her. She was able to see through unclear arguments, ask for precise definitions, and check the logical consistency of the complex metaphysical systems. It is quite possible that in Athens she was seen not only as a student, but also as an equal partner in discussion, whose unique perspective was valued. Her time in Athens broadened her understanding of Neoplatonism and gave her the depth and metaphysical grounding that would make her later teachings so comprehensive. After her time in Athens, perhaps after several years of intensive study, Hypatia returned to Alexandria. Her return was not that of a student who had completed her education, but that of a master ready to establish her own legacy. The news of her extraordinary education, her eloquence, and her sharp mind had probably preceded her. The intellectual society of Alexandria, which had known her as the daughter of Theon, now received her as an independent, fully trained philosopher of the highest rank. It was not long before Hypatia began to teach publicly. This was the decisive step that transformed her from a private scholar into a public figure. She opened her own school, which stood in the tradition of the great philosophical schools of antiquity. Her lecture hall, however, was not a closed academic space. Her lectures were open to the public and attracted a wide audience. Imagine the scene. In a large room, perhaps a hall of the Museum or a specially rented hall, people from all walks of Alexandrian society gather. There are young students, eager to be initiated into the secrets of philosophy and mathematics. There are experienced scholars, colleagues of her father, who are curious about the teachings of the young woman who has returned from Athens. And there are also high-ranking city officials, magistrates, and politicians who seek her advice on moral and ethical questions. And then Hypatia enters the room. In a world dominated by men, her very appearance is a sensation. But as soon as she begins to speak, her gender recedes into the background, and only the power of her words and the clarity of her thoughts matter. Contemporary accounts, such as the letters of her most famous student Synesius of Cyrene, describe her with the utmost reverence. She did not just talk about the abstract principles of philosophy, she made them alive and relevant to the lives of her listeners. Her education in Alexandria and Athens merged in her teaching into a unique synthesis. From her Alexandrian origin, she brought the emphasis on mathematics and the exact sciences as an indispensable preparation for philosophy. She taught her students arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music theory. The quadrivium, the four paths that, according to Platonic thought, lead the soul from the changeable world of the senses to the unchangeable world of ideas. She commented on the works of Euclid and Ptolemy, but also on those of the mathematician Diophantus of Alexandria, whose Arithmetica dealt with solving algebraic equations. Hypatia's work on Diophantus shows her interest in the most advanced mathematical problems of her time. She was not just a preserver of old knowledge, but an active researcher at the forefront of science. From her Athenian education, she brought the ability to place these scientific studies in a larger philosophical and spiritual context. She taught the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle as a foundation. She introduced her advanced students to the complex metaphysical systems of Neoplatonism, as developed by Plotinus and his successors. She taught them to reflect on the nature of reality, the structure of the cosmos, and the place of humanity within it. Her goal, as was common in Neoplatonism, was the ethical and intellectual purification of her students, to lead them to a virtuous life and an approach to the divine. Her teaching method was likely dialogical, in the Socratic style. She encouraged her students to ask questions, to think critically, and to search for truth independently. She was known for her patience and her ability to explain even the most difficult concepts in an understandable way. The atmosphere in her school must have been one of intense intellectual exchange and mutual respect. Thus, after her return from Athens, Hypatia quickly established herself as the new intellectual center of Alexandria. She took the torch from her father Theon and carried it further, her own light shining even brighter. Her education, which united the best of the two great centers of ancient learning, the scientific rigor of Alexandria, and the metaphysical depth of Athens made her a unique and preeminent figure. She was no longer just the daughter of a famous scholar. She was Hypatia, the philosopher, a master who attracted students from all over the empire and shaped the intellectual life of her city in a way that few had done before her. Her school became a beacon of thought in an increasingly turbulent time, and her name became the epitome of wisdom, eloquence, and intellectual sovereignty. Chapter 3: The Philosopher and Teacher. The years during which Hypatia taught in Alexandria mark the pinnacle of her life and work. It was a time when her fame radiated far beyond the borders of Egypt, and her school became a magnet for the brightest and most ambitious young men of the Roman Empire. After her education in the two great intellectual centers of Athens and Alexandria had made her a scholar of unique standing, she now entered her most productive phase as a philosopher and teacher. Her work during this period was characterized by a deep devotion to the ideals of reason, virtue, and the tireless search for truth. Let's imagine her daily life as a teacher. The day probably began early, with personal study and preparation for her lectures. In her study, surrounded by the precious papyrus scrolls containing the works of Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, and the great mathematicians, she delved into the texts she would teach. Her work was not just that of a regurgitator of old knowledge. As a mathematician and astronomer, she was a researcher herself. She worked on commentaries on the works of earlier masters, such as the aforementioned Diophantus or Apollonius of Perga, whose treatise on conic sections was among the most challenging mathematical texts of antiquity. These commentaries were not mere summaries. They often contained new solutions, alternative proofs, and extensions of the original theories. She may also have developed new, improved versions of scientific instruments, such as the astrolabe or the hydroscope, a device for measuring the density of liquids. Her scientific work was the foundation of her philosophical teaching. It demonstrated the power of the human mind to reveal the hidden order and harmony of the cosmos. In the morning, she would then give her public lectures. Imagine the path from her home to her lecture hall. As she walked through the bustling streets of Alexandria, dressed in the simple but dignified cloak of philosophers, the tribun, she caused a stir. Damascius, a later Neoplatonic philosopher, reports that she moved about in public without shyness and even went to the assemblies of the city's rulers. Her presence was so respected that men would pause in her presence, seized by a mixture of admiration and awe. Her public lectures were likely introductions to philosophy. Here she spoke about the fundamentals of ethics, about the teachings of Plato and Aristotle, and made these often difficult concepts accessible to a wider audience. Her language, as her students reported, was clear, eloquent, and persuasive. She did not speak from a detached academic standpoint, but connected philosophical principles with the practical questions of life. How does one lead a good life? What is justice? What is the nature of friendship? In a time of great social and political uncertainty, her lectures offered people a moral compass, an anchor in the storm of the times. In the afternoon, she would devote herself to her closer students, the inner circle, whom she introduced to the higher mysteries of Neoplatonic philosophy and advanced mathematics. These seminars took place in a more private, intimate atmosphere. Here, she read and interpreted Plato's dialogues or the Enneads of Plotinus with her students. The Neoplatonism that Hypatia taught was a demanding, hierarchical philosophy. At its apex stood the One, or the Good, a principle that lay beyond all being and thought, absolutely transcendent and indescribable. From this One, like light from an inexhaustible source, all of reality emanated in descending stages. First, the divine intellect, nous, which contains Plato's eternal ideas, then the world soul, psyche, which animates and orders the cosmos, and finally the material world of the senses, which possesses the least degree of reality. For Hypatia and her students, the goal of the philosophical life was a return, a re-ascent of the individual soul through these stages of reality back to its origin in the One. This ascent was not a purely mystical act, but a disciplined process of intellectual and moral purification. Mathematics played a crucial role in this. The study of arithmetic and geometry cleansed the mind of the confusion of sensory impressions and accustomed it to dealing with abstract, eternal truths. Astronomy lifted the gaze from the earth to the heavens and allowed the soul to behold the divine harmony and order of the cosmos. Only after this propedeutic or preparatory training was the mind ready for dialectic, the highest form of philosophical inquiry, which dealt with the eternal ideas themselves, and finally with the incomprehensible one. Hypatia's teaching was thus a holistic path. It encompassed logic, natural science, ethics, and metaphysics. It aimed not only to train the mind, but to form the whole person. She demanded from her students intellectual honesty, moral integrity, and a way of life that was in harmony with philosophical principles. The most famous of her students, Synesius of Cyrene, who later became Bishop of Ptolemy, gives us a vivid insight into the relationship between Hypatia and her circle of students in his surviving letters. He calls her mother, sister, teacher, and benefactress, and speaks of her with the greatest reverence. His letters show that Hypatia's school was more than just an educational institution. It was a community, a circle of friends, bound by common intellectual and spiritual goals. Synesius continued to write to her even after his studies ended, asking for her advice on both philosophical and practical matters, such as the construction of a scientific instrument. He sent her his own writings for her review and longed for the intellectual exchange with her and his former fellow students. These letters also reveal the remarkable diversity of her student circle. Synesius was a wealthy aristocrat and Christian who embarked on a high ecclesiastical career. Other students were pagans and came from all parts of the empire. In Hypatia's school, religious affiliation seems to have played no role. What mattered was the shared devotion to Philosophia, the love of wisdom. Hypatia herself remained true to the pagan Greek traditions, but she taught with an openness and tolerance that allowed Christians like Synesius to learn from her and to reconcile Neoplatonic philosophy with their own faith. In her lecture hall, a climate of rational discourse prevailed, standing above the religious divides of her time. This made her school a rare oasis of tolerance in an increasingly polarized world. Hypatia's influence was not limited to her circle of students. As one of the most prominent public figures in Alexandria, she also became an important moral and political authority. The sources report that she maintained close contact with the leading politicians of the city. The Praetorian prefect Orestes, the highest representative of the Roman central government in Egypt, was a friend and admirer of hers. He visited her regularly to seek her advice. These conversations likely involved more than just personal philosophical edification. In a time when political decisions were often driven by personal ambitions and power struggles, Hypatia offered a perspective based on reason, justice, and the common good. Her philosophical training gave her the ability to analyze complex situations, to discern the true motives behind people's actions, and to propose solutions that corresponded to the Platonic ideal of a well-ordered state. Her status as a woman who moved with such sovereignty in this male-dominated world of high politics and philosophy was extraordinary. She never married and remained childless, a decision that gave her the freedom to devote herself entirely to her intellectual life. She embodied the ideal of philosophical asceticism, of independence from passions and worldly entanglements, in order to keep the mind free for higher truths. Her contemporaries seem to have respected this decision. Her virtue and her intellectual brilliance protected her from the usual slanders, and gave her an authority based solely on her personal excellence. Thus, at the height of her work, Hypatia stood as a pillar of classical scholarship and philosophical reason. Her school was a thriving center of learning. Her scientific works contributed to the advancement of mathematics and astronomy. Her public lectures offered guidance to the citizens. Her advice was sought by the powerful. She was the living embodiment of the Platonic ideal of the philosopher who does not retreat into an ivory tower, but actively participates in the life of the community, trying to improve it through the application of wisdom and reason. She was the soul of intellectual Alexandria, a beacon whose light shone far beyond the walls of her beloved city. Yet, while her star shone brightest, the dark clouds of conflict were already gathering on the horizon, soon to cast a shadow over her life and the entire cultural climate of Alexandria. Chapter 4: The Cultural and Political Conflict. While Hypatia's school was an oasis of rational discourse and interfaith tolerance, the city of Alexandria around her was seething with unresolved tensions and deep conflicts. To understand the tragedy of her later fate, we must turn our gaze from the calm atmosphere of her lecture hall to the loud, often violent reality of the streets of Alexandria in the early 5th century. Let us consider the complex mix of cultural, religious, and political forces that made this time so explosive. Take a deep breath and imagine a city whose magnificent facade was cracking, through which the smoke of smoldering conflicts was rising. Alexandria had always been a melting pot. Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and Romans had lived side by side for centuries, but not always peacefully. During Hypatia's lifetime, this old mix was radically changed by a new, ever more powerful factor: Christianity. Since the Edict of Milan in 313, Christianity had changed its status from a persecuted sect to a promoted and soon dominant religion in the Roman Empire. In the year 391, Emperor Theodosius I issued edicts that banned pagan cults and effectively made Christianity the state religion. This change had dramatic consequences in Alexandria. The city was an old center of paganism. Here stood the Serapeum, a magnificent temple complex dedicated to the syncretic god Serapis, which housed the famous daughter library of the Musam for the pagans of the city, which included the philosophical circles around Hypatia and her father. This was a sacred place, a symbol of their venerable cultural and religious tradition. For the rising Christians, however, it was a hotbed of idolatry and demon worship. In the year 391, when Hypatia was already a young woman, the conflict reached its first peak. Incited by the then Patriarch Theophilus, a power-conscious and militant church leader, a Christian mob marched to the Serapeum and destroyed it. The magnificent statues were smashed, the sacred halls desecrated, and the priceless papyrus scrolls of the library were either destroyed or scattered. This act of destruction was more than just vandalism. It was a symbolic victory of Christianity over the old pagan culture. For the city's intellectual elite, for people like Theon and Hypatia, this must have been a traumatic event. It was an attack on the heart of their world, a demonstration that brute force and religious zeal could triumph over reason and the preservation of knowledge. The destruction of the Serapeum left a deep wound in the city's cultural memory and created a climate of fear and mistrust. Another old point of conflict in the city was the relationship between the Greco-Roman population and the large and long-established Jewish community. Anti-Semitic sentiments were widespread in the ancient world and repeatedly flared up in violent pogroms in Alexandria. With the rise of Christianity, this conflict acquired a new theological dimension. The Christians saw the Jews as the deniers of the Messiah, and the tensions between the two monotheistic religions were often even more intense than those between Christians and pagans. Into this explosive mixture, in the year 412, a new, decisive figure entered. Cyril, the nephew of Theophilus, was elected the new Patriarch of Alexandria after his uncle's death. Cyril was a man of great intelligence, divisive rhetoric, and unbridled ambition. He was a strict theologian who wanted to enforce orthodoxy with an iron fist, and an equally cunning power politician who strove to extend the authority of the church over all aspects of city life. Unlike his uncle, who often compromised with secular power, Cyril sought confrontation. He saw himself as the sole shepherd of his flock and was unwilling to share his authority with anyone. One of his first official acts was a massive blow against the Jewish community. After a series of mutual provocations and nightly acts of violence between Christian and Jewish groups, Cyril exploited the heated atmosphere. He mobilized his followers, especially a militant group of monks called the Parabolani, who officially served as nurses but often acted as Cyril's private thugs. In the year 414, this Christian mob expelled the Jews from Alexandria, plundered their synagogues and houses, and thus ended a presence that had lasted for centuries. This act was an illegal usurpation of power, a direct challenge to state authority, as only the imperial prefect had the right to impose such punitive measures. And here, the second key figure on the political stage enters the scene: Orestes, the Praetorian prefect of Egypt. Orestes was the highest representative of the Roman emperor in the province. He was responsible for maintaining law and order, administration, and justice. Orestes was a Christian, but above all, he was a Roman official. He saw it as his duty to uphold imperial authority and to maintain a balance between the different groups in the city. He was appalled by Cyril's unilateral action against the Jews and tried to curb his growing influence. Thus, a bitter power struggle developed between the patriarch and the prefect, between ecclesiastical and secular power. Cyril controlled the pulpits and could mobilize the Christian masses. Orestes had the legions and the state bureaucracy behind him. The city became the stage for their conflict. Both wrote to the imperial court in Constantinople, accusing each other and seeking the emperor's support. Cyril tried to bribe Orestes with a large sum of money, which he refused. In response, Cyril brought hundreds of monks from the desert into the city to intimidate Orestes. These fanatical ascetics confronted the prefect in the open street, insulting him as a pagan and an idolater. One of them, a monk named Ammonius, threw a stone and injured Orestes on the head. Orestes then had Ammonius arrested, tortured, and executed. Cyril immediately declared the executed monk a martyr, which further inflamed the situation. In the midst of this escalating conflict stood Hypatia. She was not a political activist, but her position and influence inevitably made her a figure in the political game. Hypatia was a close friend and advisor to the prefect Orestes. Their relationship was based on mutual respect and a common intellectual foundation. Orestes, though a Christian, was a man of classical education. He valued Hypatia's wisdom, her rational approach to problems, and her apparently impartial, justice-oriented attitude. Her house became an important meeting place for the city's intellectual and political elite, who felt connected to Orestes' moderate course. This circle of influential men, both Christians and pagans, who gathered around a pagan philosopher, was a thorn in the side of Cyril and his radical followers. From the perspective of Cyril's camp, Hypatia was a dangerous figure. First, she was a prominent pagan. At a time when Christianity was asserting its total claim, her public teaching of pagan philosophy was a provocation. She was a living symbol of the old world that they wanted to overcome. Second, she was a woman who played a public role and exerted great influence over powerful men. This fundamentally contradicted the patriarchal views of the church leaders of the time, according to which women should withdraw from public life and remain silent. A woman who taught, governed, and advised men was an anomaly, a reversal of the God-willed order. And third, and this was the crucial point, she was the closest confidant of Cyril's main enemy, Orestes. In the paranoid and rumor-filled atmosphere of the city, a fatal narrative began to spread. Cyril's propaganda machine began to portray Hypatia as the driving force behind Orestes' unyielding stance. The rumor was put out that it was Hypatia who, with her pagan, diabolical arts of seduction, was preventing Orestes from reconciling with the patriarch. She was stylized as the scapegoat for the political stalemate, a witch who had enchanted the Christian prefect and was thus preventing peace in the city. This rumor fell on fertile ground. It combined political enmity against Orestes with religious hatred of paganism and misogynistic fear of a powerful woman. For the uneducated Christian masses, incited by the sermons in the churches, this was a simple and convincing explanation for the complex conflict. The problem was not Cyril's lust for power or Orestes' insistence on state authority, but an evil pagan woman pulling the strings in the background. Hypatia, who taught the virtue of reason and measured judgment in her lecture hall, became the object of the wildest and most irrational projections of hatred in the street. She, who stood for tolerance and dialogue across religious boundaries, was made a symbol of division. The atmosphere in Alexandria became increasingly toxic. The air, once filled with the spirit of debate, was now heavy with hatred. Intellectual curiosity gave way to fanatical zeal. The waves of the Mediterranean, which for so many centuries had carried the ships of scholars into the harbor, now seemed to whisper a baleful melody of coming doom to the shore. The cultural and political conflict had chosen its victim. Hypatia's days were numbered. Chapter 5: The Tragic Death of a Philosopher. The winter of the year 415 was drawing to a close, and Lent, a period of penance and spiritual reflection in the Christian calendar, had begun in Alexandria. But the atmosphere in the city was anything but pious and peaceful. The power struggle between Patriarch Cyril and Prefect Orestes had reached a deadly peak, deeply dividing the city's society. The air was electric, filled with rumors, sermons of hate, and a sinister foreboding. In the midst of this storm, Hypatia tried to maintain her routine, to give her lectures, and to remain true to her role as the voice of reason. But the forces of irrationality, which she sought to overcome in her philosophical discourses, had formed into a deadly power on the street. Let us allow the events that led to her terrible end to pass slowly and with due solemnity before our inner eye. It is a dark story, but we must look at it to understand the fragility of civilization and the courage of those who stand against barbarism. The propaganda campaign against Hypatia had unfolded its devastating effect. In the churches and marketplaces, she was openly denounced as a witch and an obstacle to peace in the city. The simple but effective slander that it was she who, with dark arts, was preventing Orestes from reconciling with the Patriarch had become fixed in the minds of the fanatical mob. She became the projection screen for all the frustration and hatred that had built up in the conflict between secular and ecclesiastical power. On a fateful day in March of the year 415, Hypatia was on her way home from her lectures, as usual, in her litter or chariot. The streets of Alexandria were busy, but on this day there was a different kind of liveliness in the air, a feverish, aggressive energy. Suddenly, her path was blocked by a mob. It was not a random gathering of people. It was an organized group, led by a man named Peter, a reader in one of the churches, and thus a minor cleric in Cyril's service. This Peter and his men were the executive arm of the hatred that had been preached from the pulpits. The sight must have been terrifying. The roaring crowd of men, their faces distorted by fanatical zeal, surrounded her vehicle. They brutally dragged the philosopher, a woman of about 60, whose life had been dedicated to the peaceful pursuit of knowledge, into the street. The dignity and respect that were normally afforded her were wiped away. In that moment, in the eyes of the mob, she was no longer the admired teacher, no longer the wise adviser, but only the hated pagan, the witch who had to be destroyed. They dragged her through the streets. One can imagine her screams, drowned out by the roar of the crowd. Their destination was a nearby church, the so-called Caesareum. This had once been a pagan temple, begun by Cleopatra and completed by Augustus in honor of Julius Caesar, but was now converted into one of the city's main churches. The choice of this location was of cruel irony and symbolism. Here, in a repurposed center of the old world, the last great representative of pagan philosophy was to meet her end. What happened next is almost unsurpassed in its brutality, and is described with shocking clarity by the Christian historian Socrates Scholasticus, our main source for these events. In the church, a place that should be dedicated to prayer and charity, they tore her clothes from her body. Then, in an act of unimaginable barbarity, they murdered her. They used ostraka, which can be translated as either roof tiles or sharp-edged oyster shells. With these improvised horrific tools they scraped and cut the flesh from her bones while she was still alive. Let us pause for a moment in the silence to grasp the enormity of this act. This was not a quick death in the heat of a struggle. It was a ritual act of dismemberment, a systematic annihilation not only of a life, but also of what that life represented. It was the ultimate triumph of brute force over the mind, of fanatical hatred over rational debate, of darkness over light. But the horror was not yet over. After they had killed Hypatia in this most cruel manner, they gathered her mutilated mortal remains. They dragged the body parts out of the church to a place called Cinaron, where they built a large pyre. There they burned what was left of the great philosopher, committing her body to the flames, as if to ensure that not even a trace of her would remain, no grave at which her students could mourn. The ashes were scattered into the wind of Alexandria. The news of this monstrous crime spread like wildfire through the city and beyond. The immediate reaction was shock and horror, even in many parts of the Christian community. The murder of Hypatia was a scandal, a disgrace that cast a dark shadow over the city and the Church of Alexandria. Orestes, the prefect, Hypatia's friend and patron, was devastated and politically defeated. The murder of his most important advisor was the ultimate bloody message from Cyril. It was a demonstration that the patriarch would not shrink from unleashing the most gruesome violence to achieve his goals. Orestes had nothing left to fight with. He gave up the struggle and left Alexandria. Cyril had won. The secular power was humiliated, and the authority of the patriarch was unchallenged. The question of Cyril's direct responsibility for the murder of Hypatia is still debated by historians today. The sources do not explicitly say that Cyril ordered the murder, but they make it clear that it was his hatred, his sermons, and his propaganda campaign that created the climate in which such a crime was possible and could be seen by his followers as a godly act. The leader of the mob, Peter, was a man from his immediate circle. Cyril fanned the flames of hatred, and it is hard to imagine that he was surprised when the fire got out of control and consumed the woman he saw as his main adversary in the battle for the soul of Alexandria. While he did not publicly condone the murder, he did nothing to bring the murderers to justice. The official investigation, ordered by the imperial court, petered out within Cyril's sphere of influence. No one was ever punished for the murder of Hypatia. The death of Hypatia was more than just the death of a single person. It was a symbolic turning point. It marked the end of the classical pagan philosophical tradition in Alexandria. After this event, no one dared to publicly teach philosophy in the tradition of Plato and Plotinus. Fear had strangled intellectual freedom. Many of the remaining pagan scholars left the city if they could. The school of Alexandria, which had been a center of thought for over 700 years, never recovered from this blow. The beacon of knowledge, which had been flickering for so long, was now almost extinguished. Hypatia's death echoed through the late Roman Empire. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious fanaticism and mob violence. For her friends and students, it was an unspeakable personal tragedy. Synesius was already dead by this time, but had he learned of it, his heart would have been broken. For subsequent generations, her death became a powerful symbol, a symbol of the conflict between science and dogmatism, between tolerance and fanaticism, between enlightened reason and brutal violence. In the silence that followed the storm, a shroud fell over the intellectual life of Alexandria. The alleys where the liveliest debates had once taken place were now quieter. The halls where the voice of wisdom had spoken were empty. The tragic death of the philosopher had left a vacuum that was not to be filled. Her body had been destroyed, but the story of her life and death could not be erased. It became a legacy, a legend that would endure through the centuries, and be told again and again as an eternal warning and inspiration. Chapter 6: The Legacy of Hypatia. The smoke over the pyre at Cinaron had long since cleared, and the ashes of the murdered philosopher had mixed with the dust of the Alexandrian streets. The immediate victor seemed clear. Cyril had consolidated his power, and the militant Christian faction controlled the city. Paganism in Alexandria had suffered a fatal blow from which it would not recover. It seemed as if the light that Hypatia had kindled had been extinguished forever. But the true legacy of a person is not measured by the immediate outcome of the conflicts of their time, but by the traces their life and ideas leave in the hearts and minds of posterity. And Hypatia's legacy, as we shall now contemplate in all tranquility, proved to be far more enduring than the power of her murderers. Breathe gently in and out, and let us trace the long threads that run from Hypatia's life through the fabric of history to our present day. Her legacy is multifaceted, composed of her direct influence on her students, the survival of her scientific work, and perhaps most powerfully, the potent symbol she became after her death. Her most immediate legacy lived on in her students. Men like Synesius of Cyrene carried the education they received and her philosophical ideals into their own careers. Synesius, the Christian bishop who had studied with the pagan philosopher, is the best example of the synthesis that was possible in Hypatia's school. He used his Neoplatonic training to think through theological questions, and his scientific curiosity, fostered by Hypatia, lived on in his interest in astronomy and instrument-making. His writings and his work as a bishop reflect the ideals of reason, culture, and a humanistic ethic that he had learned in Alexandria. Through him and others like him, the currents of classical philosophy that Hypatia represented flowed into the Christian thought of the early Middle Ages. They did not simply disappear, but were transformed and integrated into a new context. Her scientific heritage was not completely obliterated either. Although none of her writings have likely survived directly under her own name, it is very probable that her work was incorporated into the works of others. Her commentary on the Arithmetica of Diophantus and on the Conics of Apollonius may have been used and passed on by later mathematicians. Her revision of Ptolemy Almagest, which she carried out together with her father Theon, became the standard edition of this fundamental astronomical text for the coming centuries. Every time a Byzantine, Arab, or later a European scholar studied this version of the Almagest to understand the movements of the stars, they were perhaps, without knowing it, also looking through the eyes of Hypatia. Her precise clarifying hand had shaped the text for posterity. Thus her scientific spirit lived on in secret, embedded in the great works she had studied and improved. She became an invisible but present force in the long chain of the transmission of knowledge. But the most powerful dimension of her legacy lies in her transformation into a symbol. Her cruel death made her story unforgettable. She became a martyr, not for a religion, but for philosophy and science. In the Byzantine Empire, the successor to the Eastern Roman Empire, her story was preserved in lexicons and chronicles, such as the great encyclopedic work called the Suda from the 10th century. Here, her life and scholarship were praised and her death depicted as a terrible tragedy. Although the empire was Christian Orthodox, it preserved a memory of the great pagan philosopher and honored her intellectual stature. With the Renaissance in Europe, as scholars began to rediscover the ancient Greek texts, the figure of Hypatia was also revived. She became a hero for the humanists, who celebrated the rebirth of classical education and often found themselves in conflict with the dogmatic authority of the Church. In Hypatia, they found a historical figure who seemed to mirror their own struggles. Her image became particularly potent during the Enlightenment in the 18th century. Thinkers like Voltaire saw in Hypatia's fate the perfect allegory for the eternal struggle between reason and superstition, between enlightened thought and religious fanaticism. In their writings, Hypatia became an icon of the free spirit, brutally destroyed by the dark forces of intolerance and dogmatism. Her murderer, Cyril, who is venerated as a saint and doctor of the Church by the Catholic and Orthodox churches, became in this reading the epitome of the power-hungry anti-science priest. The story of Hypatia and Cyril became a founding myth of the modern secular worldview, which demanded the separation of church and state and the freedom of thought. In the 19th and 20th centuries, another equally strong dimension was added to her legacy: the feminist interpretation. With the rise of the women's movement, Hypatia was rediscovered as one of the earliest and most important champions of women's intellectual equality. Her story was proof that women were capable of the highest intellectual achievements, even in antiquity, if only they were given the chance. She was a woman who, in a world completely dominated by men, had fought her way to the top of the academic world through sheer force of intellect. Her life refuted the prejudice of women's intellectual inferiority in the most impressive way. In this context, her tragic death was interpreted not only as an attack on science, but also as a brutal act of patriarchy. punishing a woman who had dared to transgress her assigned boundaries and enter the domains of power and public teaching. Hypatia became an icon for generations of women fighting for their right to education, to a career of their own, and to a voice in society. Her name became a banner under which the fight against misogyny and for the recognition of female achievements in science, art, and politics was rallied. Thus, Hypatia's legacy has transformed and been charged with new meanings over the centuries. She is the last great pagan philosopher, the martyr of science, the hero of the Enlightenment, and the icon of feminism. Each era has found in her story what it needed for its own struggles and aspirations. Perhaps her deepest and most universal legacy, however, lies beyond these specific interpretations. It lies in the quiet dignity of her life, which was entirely dedicated to Philosophia, the love of wisdom. It lies in her unwavering belief in the power of reason to build bridges and to make the world more understandable. It lies in her personal integrity and her courage to stand by her principles, even in the face of growing danger. When we think of Hypatia today, we can see the image of a woman who, in a turbulent time of transition, created a space of tranquility, clarity, and tolerance. A space where the best argument counted, not the loudest voice. A space where the common search for truth was more important than the dividing dogmas of religion or origin. Her life reminds us that civilization is a fragile good that must be defended anew in every generation, defended against the ever-lurking forces of hatred, fanaticism, and ignorance. Her light was violently extinguished on that March day in the year 415. But the idea for which she lived and died, the idea that a life dedicated to reason, knowledge, and virtue is a good and meaningful life, this idea could not be burned. It smolders on through history, like an eternal intellectual fire, waiting to be rekindled by each of us. That is the true, immortal legacy of Hypatia of Alexandria. Outro, final thoughts. And so our journey to the Alexandria of late antiquity, to the life of the extraordinary philosopher Hypatia, comes to an end. The echoes of her story, the tales of her brilliant mind and her tragic end, slowly fade, making way for the silence of the night. The images of the vibrant metropolis